Every year they save hundreds of lives here off the Shetland Islands in some of the toughest conditions that you can imagine. We're talking about Her Majesty's Coastguard, widely recognized as among the finest search and rescue operators in the world. The helicopter that the search and rescue team operates is the Sikorsky S-92, one of the most advanced helicopters of their class in the world. The seas behind me look pretty tranquil now, but they can get extremely difficult. As the helicopter passes me, I can tell you that the sea state and the wind state that these men operate in are some of the toughest anywhere in the world. Located northeast of the British mainland, the Shetland Isles are considered a subarctic archipelago in Scotland and lie to the northeast of Orkney and form part of the division between the Atlantic to the west and the North Sea to the east. The administrative centre is Lerwick, a short distance away from Sombra, which serves as a major base for the Coast Guard search and rescue services. So just what is it that makes the men of Her Majesty's Coast Guard so highly rated? Take a look at this. In 2002, a large bulk carrier, the MV Kodima, ran aground off Cornwall. Salvage workers were being winched to safety after gale force winds lashed the decks of the ship. What you see is footage of waves actually crashing onto the helicopter as winching operations were going on. And this is just another example. In January 2000, a fishing vessel, the Be Ready, caught fire in heavy sea conditions northwest of Westray off the Orkney Islands. With shore-based lifeboats unable to make progress in the heavy sea state, a Coast Guard helicopter operating out of Sombra in the Shetlands was called in for the rescue mission, ultimately being able to winch up all the crew members from their life raft. Freddie Manson is a winchman, a rescue specialist and paramedic who performs the dangerous mission of getting down to vessels in distress and pulling people out of peril. Recognized and awarded for his bravery in missions, Freddie explains just how tough it can get.
On the particular night, then it was a really stormy night. As I say, it was gusting up to force 10 storm winds, which is hurricane storm winds. And this vessel had gone on to the rocks, and it was a very sort of tight area to try and winch from. And then she slipped away from the rocks itself and started to sink by the bow. So the crew that were on board made for the bridge roof, and we winched on top of the bridge roof, and I put 2 people into the strops, and as they were being winched clear, the bow sank completely, and this large wave came right over the top of everything and washed us up the bridge roof initially. Thankfully there was a gantry area the sort of after the bridge roof where we did the rest of the winching from, because I was in an area where I could actually keep a hold of the rails. Yeah. Most of the time I was waist deep in water with the waves crashing over the top of me. In that time I took quite a battering as well, if you like. Afterwards my helmet was written off, the radio was written off, the suit I was wearing was written off because it was torn. I've got some chip bones in my legs, shins. I was bruised from the waist down. There was at one point where the vessel started to slide on the rocks, and was entering into deep water, and we knew that it was 40 metres, roughly speaking, about 40 metres of water there. And I actually did think this was it.
Today we've been invited to meet the men of the Search and Rescue Squad of the Coast Guard, fly with them and get an idea of just what it is to be part of this very elite service. And that includes the opportunity to actually winch down to ships in the choppy waters of the North Atlantic. This is a story of how human skill matched to the technological precision of a world-class helicopter gives the British Coast Guard the ability to reach out to distressed sailors in conditions where angels would fear to tread. And here's where it begins, at the Coast Guard's Rescue Coordination Centre at Lowick, where the movement of all ships is monitored real-time. Regulating the movement of ships in this part of the North Atlantic and ensuring the safety of sailors as they pass through these treacherous waters is the primary focus.
The winter here is characterized by strong winds and high seas. So we always encourage people to listen for the weather forecast, which we broadcast on a regular basis, so that if people are going to sea, they know what sort of weather conditions to expect. Any time of day, any time of night, no matter what the weather conditions, they could be asked to go out and carry out a rescue. So they train on a regular basis to do just that.
We have to give 24 hours notice.
Back at the base at Sombra, Bruce Morrison is preparing his team for a mission. Weather forecasts and a thorough briefing of the do's and don'ts of the mission. A quick review of the state of the helicopter, and the team is ready. Today we'll be joining the team on a training operation of one of the sharp cliffs which dot these islands. As we get set to take off, Bruce tells me why the Sikorsky S-92, a new induction into the British Coast Guard, is such an exceptional platform.
With the glass cockpit, as you can see from here, we have the flight instruments. Mainly we have the flight instruments on this MFD panel, nav instruments, and then generally the engine instruments in the centre. It allows us a little bit more flexibility. We can display more things, we can take things away, bring things up at different flight modes to make it safer and easier for us to operate the aircraft. In the old aircraft, all the instruments were set in place, and you didn't have the same sort of flexibility to move the information around. We can also call up the FLIR from the back seat so that we can see the FLIR picture up here on the front if required.
The sharp cliffs around the main island at Shetland are perfect to test out the skills of the winchman. In fact, as the helicopter gets close to the cliffs, the actual controls of the helicopter can be transferred to one of the crew members in the main cabin. As we fly back to Sombra, I get an idea of just what I'm in for. The Coast Guard have asked me if I would be interested in winching down to a ship in the North Atlantic. And to ensure that I feel perfectly at home, they've decided to select an Indian cargo carrier traveling through these waters.
%80 of the time it's quite benign, but it gets really quite rough out there, and they have to be on the top of their game.
Tell us about how rough it potentially gets through an example, perhaps.
You can get 40-foot seas, 50-foot seas out there. I have had an occasion a few years ago now where a helicopter ditched into the North Sea, And we were hovering about 200 feet above the water, and the crewmen actually entered the water 100 feet below the aircraft. So the swell, it was one big swell that was running through.
Coming up next, winching down from a helicopter to the deck of a moving ship in the North Atlantic, an experience like no other.
In the last 15 years of having covered aviation, I've had several bizarre, sometimes frightening experiences. Flying with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, landing on tiny helipads in the Siachen Glacier, and flying very low sometimes on fighter aircraft with several air forces around the world. But today's experience is going to be really special. This yellow immersion suit is something that Her Majesty's Coast Guard, who we are with, requires me to wear. We're on the Shetland Islands in the very north of England, and the frigid North Atlantic is all around us. Today we're going to get a feel of what it is to be with the search and rescue team of Her Majesty's Coast Guard as we go down to ships, as we go to the cliffs in this area and winch down and winch up to get a first-hand feel for what it's meant to be in this sport.
Right, it's time to head to the briefing room.
Vishnu or Jamie may well get winched out, so to that end they're familiar with winching but not obviously with our equipment, our helicopter or our procedures. So what we'll do on start-up for Edie and Ginger is we'll hover taxi probably over to the winching area, the light aircraft park, and just move to the side to a position of your choosing, preferably over the grass, and come into a 30-40 foot hover and then just run through a winching brief for the guys so they're familiar with the equipment, the downwash, etc. And then once we're happy with that, we'll depart off up to the east. If we see a boat, we're going to have a look at that first, subject to what the power is. The other shot they quite like to do is we winch down onto an island and then take some footage of the helicopter moving past.
Obviously, locating an appropriate ship, a target of opportunity as it were, takes time. And here's where the Sikorsky S-92 comes into its own. With extraordinary range, it has the legs to keep flying, something that is critical in extended missions over the sea, where there is no diversionary airfield.
We've got a range, we can go out to 250 miles, we can stay there for half an hour on task and then we can come back. So that's our radius of action, but if we had to go in one direction, we could do, at least with the aircraft in the configuration it is at the moment, we could get over 500 miles, and then we've got an internal tank that gives us another hour's duration on top of that.
Right, it's time for me to get an idea of just what winching down to the deck of a moving ship is all about.
There are too many things which I've not tried when it comes to aviation. This is something I've actually done before, but every time one does it, it just seems to be utterly, completely crazy. Winching down from a helicopter and then being winched up is actually quite a painful affair. The winch actually attaches itself to under your arm, and every time you lift it up from the ground, it hurts like hell.
I've winched off a submarine in the past, but winching down to a moving ship, that too on the heavy seas of the North Atlantic, is bound to be different. But to make me feel right at home, the Coast Guard decide to pick an Indian ship for me to touch down on. Here we go. Soon, though, it's time to get back onto the helicopter and return to Sambra. But not without admiring the stunning countryside. This is clearly one of the most beautiful places on Earth. For me, the story of the British Coast Guard isn't just about their helicopter or their mission. It's about the camaraderie that defines their team. And without that, search and rescue in this area would just not have been possible.
You know, it's a small group of people I work with in Shetland, and you know, the boys, we've all got a certain thing about each individual which makes us a good team. And it's not an individual that does a job, it's the team that does a job, and it's second to none.
Sunset on the stunning Shetland Isles. Looks absolutely incredible, doesn't it? More than a picture postcard. These colors are just remarkable. And the seas behind me look quite tranquil, don't they? But in fact, for several months in a year, these seas rage and the conditions are extremely difficult. Operating in these conditions when it's far less ideal than what you see over here is exactly what Her Majesty's Coast Guard does, often on a daily basis.